On the coldest morning the mountains had ever known, every chimney in the camp poured smoke into the bleeding dawn. Every chimney but one. High on the frozen hill stood a house no one understood, a house of blinding white. They had laughed at it all autumn long, called it a fool's folly, a grieving woman's madness, painted bright and strange as a tomb. And now its chimney stood silent, cold, still as a gravestone. No smoke, not a single thread. Down in the road they stopped and they stared, and one by one their faces fell, because they all knew what no smoke meant after a night like the one that had just passed. They knew who slept up there, a woman alone, 2 small children. They had closed their doors against her, and now the sky had gone quiet over that white house on the hill, and not one of them dared to climb up and see what the dark had left behind. A widow stood alone on a frozen hillside, burying her dead husband's stone house under a coat of blinding white. The wind came down off the high country in long, thin knives. It pulled at the gray shawl around her shoulders. It stung her cheeks red, and still she did not stop. Her name was Eleni. The people in the camp below had other names for her now. They watched her from the muddy road that wound between the cabins. They leaned on their shovels on their way up to the mine or down from it, and they shook their heads. A woman past 50, a woman with grief still fresh in her eyes, standing on a ladder she had no business climbing, smearing white mud across honest gray stone. They thought she had gone soft in the head. They thought sorrow had finally cracked something loose inside her, and maybe, they whispered, that was a mercy. Maybe it was kinder than the truth. But Eleni did not climb that ladder for mercy. She climbed it because she remembered the cold. The stone house had been built by her husband, Stavros, with his own 2 hands. He was a man who understood rock the way other men understood horses or weather, where it would split, where it would hold, how it breathed in the day and gave its warmth back at night. He came from a far place across the sea, a place of white towers and sun-bleached cliffs, where families built their walls not just for shelter, but for honor. He had carried that knowledge across an ocean, and then, one quiet season, he had carried it into the ground. Now there was only Eleni, and 2 small grandchildren, her own child's children, left in her care when the world took their parents the way the world sometimes does, without asking, without warning. Nico, the boy, was 7 and serious. He watched everything with his father's dark, careful eyes. Thalia, the girl, was 5, and still believed the world was a kind place. Eleni meant to keep it that way for as long as she could, so she stood on the ladder, and she worked the white paste into the stone, thick and patient and strange. Down at the pay shed, a man named Garrett Holloway watched her with his arms folded. Holloway was the kind of man a mining camp grows around. He held the ledgers, he held the credit, he held the line between a family that ate through winter and a family that did not. And he had grown comfortable over the years, with the weight of all that power resting easy on his shoulders. He spat into the cold dirt. "That woman's gone foolish," he said, loud enough to carry, "putting parlor plaster on an outside wall." A few of the men chuckled. "Fine for a fancy house in the valley, maybe," Holloway went on. "But you wait. First warm spell comes through. That white wash runs right down the rock like spilled milk. She'll have the ugliest cabin in the camp by spring. He said it the way a man says a thing he is certain of, the way a man speaks when he has never once been wrong in front of an audience and does not intend to start now. And the men nodded, because it made sense. You built with what the mountain gave you, dark stone, dark timber. You built to blend into the hills and to endure. You did not paint your house white as a wedding cake and wait for the weather to laugh at you. It was a waste, a foolish, grieving waste. That was the verdict. And in a camp that small, a verdict spreads fast. By the next morning, the children at the well were calling it the ice house. By the morning after, the women had stopped saving her a place at the wash line. Eleni heard all of it. She heard the whispers slide off into silence when she passed. She felt the way eyes touched her back and then looked away. She knew exactly what they thought of her. The strange old widow, white mud drying on her knuckles, talking to no one, building something no one understood. And she let them think it, because they were looking at the wrong thing. They were looking at the color. They saw white, and they thought of vanity, of a clean parlor, of a woman dressing up a stone hut like it was a church on a hill. They did not see what the white was for. They did not know what she knew. Each evening, when the work was done and the children were fed, Eleni would sit by the small stove with a cup going cold in her hands, and she would remember. She would remember the first winter, not in this house, in the thin rented shack they had lived in before, when Stavros was still alive and still saving for land of their own. She remembered how the cold had come into that shack like a living thing, how the water in the bucket grew a skin of ice 3 steps from the fire, how a razor left out overnight had welded itself to skin on the first touch of morning, cold enough to raise a white welt before it ever cut, how the boys' small boots, left wet by the door, had frozen with their laces standing straight up in the dark, stiff as wire, like 2 little monuments to everything the cold could take. They had fed that stove all night. They had stuffed every crack with rag and newspaper and prayer, and still the warmth had bled away. She remembered turning to Stavros in the black hours and asking him why. Why, with the fire roaring, with the gaps all plugged, why did the cold still win? And she remembered what he told her. He did not talk about the cracks. He talked about the sky. He said the danger was not the cold creeping in. The danger was the warmth, slipping out, up through the very stone of the walls, rising into the wide clear dark above them, and never coming back. He said a clear night sky was a hungry thing, a vast, patient emptiness that drank the heat right out of a house, straight through solid rock, while a family huddled and shivered and never understood what was being taken from them. At home, he had said in that low voice she could still hear, the sun is the enemy. We learned to send it away. Here. And he had looked up at the cold ceiling. Here the enemy is the sky itself. But the answer is the same. He had meant to build it himself. The shield, the white skin, the old trick his own people had carried for 1,000 years on their bright and burning coast. He had run out of time. So now, Eleni stood on the ladder, and she did the thing the whole camp laughed at. She mixed her white paste in a wooden trough, lime and clean sand, and a fine pale clay she had hauled herself, sack by sack, from a wash up the canyon. She laid it on thick, Not a thin coat for show. A deep, generous skin that swallowed the rough face of the stone and softened every corner until the house no longer looked like a house at all. It looked like something carved from snow, a pale block on a dark hill. An iceberg, the men said, stranded 1,000 miles from any sea. And when a section had set just enough, she did the strangest thing of all. She took a smooth river stone in her palm, wet it, and began to rub, slow circles, hour after hour, day after day, pressing the surface, polishing it, working it until the gritty plaster grew dense and slick and faintly bright, like the inside of a shell, like still water under moonlight. The men who saw it shook their heads and walked on. A grieving woman, they thought, polishing a mud pie. But Eleni knew what her hands were making. She was not painting a wall. She was not decorating a tomb for her grief. She was building a mirror for the cold, a shield against the hungry, patient dark that her neighbors did not even know was reaching for them every single night, reaching down through their thick, dark walls, drinking their fires while they slept. They had months of winter coming. They were ready to fight it the only way they knew, with fire, with fuel, with brute, exhausted force. And she alone, up on that hillside, white dust on her hands, and a verdict already hung around her neck. She alone was preparing to do something none of them would understand, until the night the sky came for all of them at once. The work had a rhythm to it. Eleni found that out quickly. In the gray hour before the children woke, she would slake her lime in a timber pit by the door, and the pit would hiss and steam like something alive. She would stir it slow. She would wait. Good work could not be rushed, Stavros used to say, and a wall built in a hurry was a wall built for ruin. So she waited. She let the lime soften into a smooth, pale putty, the color of cream left out in winter light. Then she mixed her render, 1 part of the putty, 3 parts of clean, sifted sand, and a generous handful of the fine white clay she had hauled sack by aching sack from the wash up the canyon. The clay was what gave it that strange, bright skin. The clay was the secret, though no one in the camp knew enough to ask. By the time the sun climbed over the ridge, Eleni was already on the ladder, and the children were already at her feet. Nico carried water. He was 7 and serious, and he carried it the way a man carries something that matters. Both hands on the pail, eyes down, careful not to spill. He liked to be useful. He liked, Eleni thought, to feel that the house was something the 3 of them were making together. Thalia simply played. She built her own small walls out of pebbles in the cold dirt. She talked to them. She named them. And every so often she would look up at the great white shape rising above her and announce, with a 5-year-old certainty, that it was the most beautiful house in the whole world. Eleni would laugh then, a short, surprised laugh that felt almost stolen, because there had not been much laughing lately. There had not been much of anything but the work and the cold creeping closer, and the long, quiet evenings when the children slept and the house went still, and she could feel how empty the other side of the bed had become. The work helped. The work was a kind of prayer she could do with her hands, and as she laid the render thick and smoothed it slow, she could almost feel him beside her again. She could almost hear his voice in the scrape of the trowel. Not too thin, Eleni. A thin coat is for show. A thick coat is for living. She had watched him do it once. Only once. Long ago on a wall he never finished. She had stood behind him with a baby on her hip and watched his hands move. And she had thought, the way wives sometimes think without saying it, that she could do that too, if she ever had to. She had not known then that she would have to. She had not known that the quiet thought behind it, that she could do that, if she ever had to, would one day be the only thing standing between two small children and the cold. But she had watched. She had remembered. And it turned out that a woman who pays close attention can carry more than anyone gives her credit for. The camp, of course, did not see it that way. To the camp, she was still the icehouse widow, the strange old woman with white mud drying in the lines of her hands. They had decided what she was, and they were comfortable with the decision, and nothing about the slow rising of that pale wall was going to change it. The men passing on the road still smirked. The children still called it the Ice House and Garrett Holloway. Holloway watched it all from below with the patience of a man waiting to be proven right. He was certain he would be. He had said so, after all, in front of everyone. And a man like Holloway does not enjoy being wrong nearly so much as he enjoys being witnessed. Then came the morning the wall fell. It was a small thing at first. A section near the north corner, no wider than a doorway, where the render had not set the way the rest had set. Eleni saw it when she came out at dawn. A crack, fine as a hair, running down through the white. She frowned. She touched it, and under her fingers, a whole sheet of the render simply let go of the stone and slid and broke apart on the frozen ground at her feet. For a moment, she just stood there, looking at the dark wound of the bare rock where her white skin had peeled away, looking at the pieces scattered on the dirt like shards of a broken plate. And the old fear came up in her so fast, it stole her breath. What if they were right? What if the whole camp was right, and she was only a foolish, grieving woman who had wasted her last coins and her last strength on a thing that did not work? A thing that was never going to work. A thing her husband understood, and she only thought she understood. The way a child thinks she understands the sea because she has watched it from the shore. What if she had remembered it wrong? What if she had remembered all of it wrong? She did not hear Holloway come up the slope. She only heard his voice. Well now. It was almost gentle. That was the worst part. He did not even need to be cruel. The sight of the fallen wall was doing all his work for him. Spilled milk, he said softly, looking at the white shards on the ground. Didn't I say it, Eleni? Didn't I say? A few of the men had drifted up behind him. They were not laughing now. It was quieter than laughing. And worse. They looked at the broken render, and they looked at her. And something like pity moved across their faces. And pity, to a proud woman, can cut deeper than any mockery. This is no work for a woman alone, Holloway went on. His voice had turned kind, the way a trap is kind. No shame in it. A house like this, a craft like this. It died with your man. Best you accept that. Best you sell the land while it's still worth something, and find yourself somewhere small and warm in the valley, where folks can look after you. Somewhere small and warm, where folks can look after you. He made it sound like a gift. He made it sound like the only sane thing left for a broken old widow to do. And for one terrible heartbeat. Eleni almost believed him. She looked at the fallen wall. She looked at her cracked, white-stained hands, an old woman's hands, the knuckles swollen with the cold. And she thought of how tired she was, how endless the winter looked, how easy it would be to simply lay down the trowel and let someone else decide what happened to her. How easy, how quiet. Then a small hand slipped into hers. Nico. He had come out into the cold without his coat, and he was looking up at her with his father's careful dark eyes, and he did not say anything at all. He just held her hand and looked at the broken wall. And then he looked at her, as if to ask whether they should be afraid. And something in Eleni straightened. She squeezed the boy's hand. Once. Steady. "Go inside," she told him gently. "Mind your sister. I'll be in directly." Then she turned to Holloway, and the softness was gone from her face. "Thank you for your concern," she said. That was all. 4 words, laid down flat and even, like stones in a wall. Holloway waited for more. He waited for her to break, or to argue, or to thank him for the mercy of letting her quit. She gave him none of it. She simply turned back to the wall, picked up her trowel, and waited for him to leave. And after a long moment, he did. The men drifted off behind him, murmuring, and the murmur followed them down the road like smoke. When they were gone, Eleni knelt in the cold dirt and gathered the broken pieces of render into her apron, and she made herself look at them. Really look, because Stavros had taught her one more thing long ago that had nothing to do with stone and everything to do with living. When a thing breaks, he used to say, do not weep over it until you understand why it broke. Most times, the breaking is trying to teach you something. So she turned the pieces over in her hands. She studied the back of them where they had let go of the stone. And slowly, very slowly, she began to understand. The render had not failed because the idea was wrong. It had failed in one place, one corner, the north corner. The corner she had rendered on the night she could not sleep. The night the grief had come on so hard she had worked past midnight just to keep from lying awake in the dark. The night her hands had shaken so badly with cold and exhaustion that she had not let the lime slake long enough, had not mixed it patient and full, had rushed it, just that once, just to be done. A wall built in a hurry is a wall built for ruin. She heard his voice say it, and she nearly wept, not from despair this time, but from something closer to relief. Because this she could fix. This was not the failure of a foolish old woman who understood nothing. This was the failure of a grieving one who had rushed a single corner on a single sleepless night. The principle held. Everywhere she had taken her time, the white skin clung to the stone like it had grown there. Hard, bright, sealed. It was only here, only where she had hurried, that it had let go. Eleni sat back on her heels in the cold, and for the first time in a long time, she felt something steady settle into her chest. She was not wrong. She had only been tired, and tiredness could be carried. Tiredness she knew how to carry. She had been carrying it her whole life. She scraped the bad render clean down to the bare rock. She slaked a fresh batch of lime, and she let it sit, and she did not rush it, not by a single minute, no matter how the cold bit at her or how the light failed. And when she laid the new coat onto that north corner, she laid it the way Stavros would have laid it. Slow, thick, patient, as if she had all the time in the world, even though somewhere up beyond the ridge, the sky was already gathering itself for what was coming. The story of the fallen wall ran down through the camp by nightfall, but the story of the mended wall did not run anywhere at all. That was the way of it. People remembered the breaking. They did not bother to come back and look at the fixing. By morning, in the minds of the whole camp, the Ice House widow's folly was settled fact. Her wall had crumbled, just as Holloway swore it would, and the only question left was how long before she came to her senses and sold. Eleni let them think it. She had stopped expecting anything else. But Holloway did not let it lie. A man like that does not win by being right once. He wins by making sure no one is ever tempted to doubt him again. And there was something about the widow on the hill, something in the flat, even way she had said thank you for your concern, and turned her back on him, that he did not like. She had not broken, and men like Holloway need the people beneath them to break, just a little, just often enough to remember who holds the ledger. So a few days later, when Eleni came down to the company store with her thin handful of coins to buy coal for the deep cold ahead, she found the door of the credit closed against her. The clerk would not meet her eyes. "No more credit on your account, ma'am," he mumbled. "Orders." Orders from whom? Eleni said, though she already knew. The clerk did not answer. He did not have to. Across the store, by the cold stove, Garrett Holloway stood with his thumbs in his vest and watched her with an expression that was almost sorrowful. He came over slow. "It's nothing personal," he said. It was the kind of thing men like him always said, right before doing the most personal thing in the world. A widow with no man bringing in wages. That's a poor risk for the books, Eleni. You understand. If you can't pay cash for your fuel, well, he spread his hands. The company can't carry you. It wouldn't be fair to the others. Fair to the others. She almost laughed at that. "And if a body has no fuel," she said quietly, "in the cold that's coming." Holloway's face did something complicated. For just a moment, something flickered behind his eyes that might have been shame, and then it was gone, smoothed over by the easy certainty of a man who has decided that other people's troubles are a kind of weather, nothing to do with him. "Then a wise body sells her land," he said gently, "while it's still worth something, and takes the children somewhere they'll be safe and warm. There's a fair price waiting for you, Eleni. More than fair. You've only to say the word." And there it was, plain at last. He did not want her gone for her own good. He wanted her gone, and he had simply found the lever that would move her, cut off her fire, let the cold do the asking, let a frightened old woman with 2 small children look at an empty coal box and an empty purse and decide all on her own that she had no choice but to sell. It was clean. It was patient. It was almost admirable, the way cruelty can be admirable when it never has to dirty its own hands. Eleni stood very still in the cold store, and she understood in that moment exactly what she was up against. Not the cold. The cold she could answer. She had spent the whole autumn learning how to answer the cold. It was the man. It was the man who could make the cold into a weapon and hand it to her like a kindness. "I'll pay cash," she said. Her voice did not shake. "For what I can." and I'll thank you to leave my land out of your figuring." Then she counted out her thin coins onto the counter, enough for a little coal, only a little, nowhere near enough for a whole deep winter. And she carried that little out the door with her chin up and her back straight, and she did not let one soul in that store see how hard her heart was hammering. She walked all the way up the hill before her hands began to shake. The little coal she had bought would not last. She knew that. She had always known it. It was a thin wall against a wide cold, and on the worst nights, it would mean nothing at all, unless the white skin on her house did everything she believed it could do. Everything, with no margin, no spare, no second fire to fall back on if she had judged it wrong. She had bet 2 children's lives on a thing the whole camp called foolishness. And now, thanks to Holloway, there was no longer any room to be even a little bit wrong. She stood in front of the great pale house in the failing light, and she made herself believe in it. She had to. There was nothing else left to believe in. And then, as if the world had been waiting for the exact moment she had the least to give, Nico got sick. It started small, the way the worst things do. A flush in the boy's cheeks at supper. A cough he tried to hide because he did not want to worry her. By the deep of the night, the cough had turned wet and tearing, and his small body burned hot against her hand even as he shivered, and his careful dark eyes had gone glassy and far away. Eleni knew that fever. It was the kind that came up out of the cold and the damp, the kind that thinned a child down to nothing if it was not kept warm and kept watched. She had seen it take other children, in other winters, in other thin and freezing houses. She built the fire up high. She used the coal, the little precious coal she had counted out so carefully on Holloway's counter. She fed it into the stove and watched it burn down far too fast. And she held the boy against her chest through the long black hours, and she sang to him low old songs, half forgotten, the kind a person sings without deciding to, while Thalia slept curled against her other side. By morning, the fever had broken a little, but the coal box was nearly empty. And the cold she had been racing all autumn was no longer somewhere up beyond the ridge. It was here. She could feel it in the bones of the house. A new edge to the air. A stillness outside that any old woman who had lived through enough winters knew to fear. The deep, waiting stillness that comes before the worst of the cold settles in to stay. She had perhaps a day, maybe 2, and she stood in the gray morning light with a sleeping, fevered child in her arms and an almost empty coal box at her feet, and she faced the choice that Holloway had built for her as surely as if he had nailed it together with his own hands. She had a few coins left, a few, scraped from the bottom of everything. Enough for one thing, or the other. Not both. She could go down to the store, swallow her pride, and buy the last coal those coins would carry. Fuel for the fire. Warmth she could see and feel and trust. The safe thing. The thing any sensible woman would do with a sick child in her arms. Or she could spend those same coins on the last of the lime and clay she needed to finish the house, to close the final stretch of bare wall, to seal the white skin all the way around, the way it had to be sealed, completely, with no gap left for the hungry dark to reach through. The render would buy her nothing she could feel today. It would not warm the boy tonight. It would not show on her hands as anything but more white dust and more aching work. It was a promise, only a promise. A bet on a thing her husband had believed and her neighbors had laughed at, and she herself had only half proven on a single mended corner in the dim light of her own stubborn faith. The coal was certain. The wall was a gamble. And a fevered child does not care about gambles. Eleni stood there a long time. She looked at Nico's flushed, sleeping face. She looked at the small, clean stretch of bare stone still waiting at the far wall. She looked at the few coins in her palm, and she felt the whole weight of every doubting eye in that camp pressing down on her at once. She knew exactly how it would look. She knew that if she spent those last coins on white mud while her grandson burned with fever, and if anything happened to that boy, they would say she had killed him with her foolishness. They would say the grief had finally driven her mad. They would say a sane woman buys coal. And maybe they would be right. That was the thing that frightened her most. That she might be standing at the very edge of becoming the foolish old woman they all believed she already was. But Eleni had learned something across a long, hard life that the comfortable men of the camp had never had to learn. She had learned that the safe thing is not always the saving thing. The coal would warm the boy for a night, 2 nights, and then it would be gone. And the cold that was coming would still be coming, and they would be exactly where they were now, only poorer, only colder, with the deep of winter still ahead and nothing at all between her children and the dark. A little fire against a great cold was not a plan. It was a way to lose slowly. The wall, the finished wall, that was the only thing that could change the shape of the whole winter. That was the only bet big enough to matter. And a frightened woman buys coal, yes. But a woman who has truly understood the danger. A woman who has understood it the way Eleni had come to understand it, in her hands and her bones and her sleepless nights. That woman finishes the wall. She closed her fingers around the coins, and she made her choice. She bundled the children warm. She left Nico sleeping under every blanket in the house with Thalia set to watch him. And she walked down the hill, past the store, past the men who watched her go, and she spent her last coins, not on coal, but on lime and sand and the white clay. The clerk stared at her like she had lost her mind. By the time she carried it back up the hill, the whole camp knew. It moved through them faster than any fever. The widow, the fevered boy, the empty coal box, and the woman walking home, past warmth she could have bought, with a sack of white mud on her shoulder instead. Even the women turned from her now. That was the part that hurt. The men's mockery she had grown a hide against. But there had been a few women, a few, who had given her small nods at the wash line, small mercies, the quiet kindness women keep for other women carrying too much alone. A neighbor named Della Hart had been one of them. And when Eleni passed her on the road that day, the white sack heavy on her shoulder, Della did not nod. Della looked at the sack and looked at the hill where a sick child lay, and her face closed like a door. "You'd let that boy go cold," Della said, low, almost disbelieving. For mud. It was not a question. It was a verdict. And it was, in its way, the cruelest thing anyone had said to her all winter, because it came not from a man who wanted her land, but from a woman who, until that morning, had almost been a friend. Eleni did not defend herself. There was no defending it, not in words, not in a way anyone standing in the warm certainty of a full coal box would ever understand. So she only met Della's eyes and held them, just for a moment. "No," she said quietly, "not cold." And she walked on up the hill, alone now, completely alone. The last bridge to the camp burned behind her, carrying the white clay that was either going to save her family or prove every last one of them right. Behind her, the sky had begun to clear, not the soft clearing of a fair day. The hard, bright, bottomless clearing that an old woman learns to dread. The clearing that means the clouds have pulled back like a blanket dragged off a bed in the night, leaving everything beneath open and bare to the great cold dark above. Eleni felt it on the back of her neck as she climbed. She did not turn around. She knew what it was. It was the thing Stavros had warned her about. In the black hours of that first terrible winter, a lifetime ago. The sky was opening its hungry mouth, and it was almost time to find out whether a grieving old woman with white dust on her hands and the whole world set against her had built a mirror strong enough to turn it back. The cold came down in the night, like something that had decided to stay. There was no storm to announce it, no wind, no howling fury a person could point at and name and brace against. That was the strange and terrible part of it. The world simply went still. So still that the silence itself seemed to carry weight. And the sky above the camp pulled back, clear and black and bottomless, until every star burned hard and close as a chip of struck ice. It was a beautiful sky. That was the cruelty of it. It was the most beautiful sky anyone in that camp had ever stood beneath, and it was the most dangerous one, and almost none of them understood that the two things were exactly the same. Eleni understood. She stood in the doorway of the great white house with a wool blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, and she looked up at all that hard, glittering dark. And she felt the old fear move through her like a cold hand laid flat against her spine. This was the thing he had warned her of, the hungry sky, the wide black mouth that opened on the clearest nights and drank the warmth right up out of the world, straight through stone and timber and bone, while families slept and shivered and never once thought to lift their eyes and look at what was taking it. It was here now, and tonight. Tonight, she would finally learn whether everything she had wagered her family's lives upon was true. She stepped back inside, and she closed the door against the dark. The house was small and dim and full of the sound of sleeping breath. Nico lay bundled close to the stove, his fever broken at last, but his small body still thin and worn from the long fight of it. Thalia slept curled against her brother's side, one little hand fisted in his blanket, the way she always slept when she was frightened and would not say so out loud. The coal box held almost nothing, a handful, enough for a small banked fire and no more. The kind of fire that, in any other house in that camp, on a night like this one, would have been a cruel joke. A single candle held up against a flood. Eleni knelt at the stove and built that small fire anyway. Just enough to keep a low, even warmth alive in the iron. Not a roaring fire, not a fighting fire. She could not afford a fighting fire. And besides, she was not trying to fight the cold tonight. She was trying to refuse it. She banked the coals down low, She shut the little iron door, and then she sat back on her heels in the dim glow, and she folded her aching hands in her lap, and she waited. She prayed in her wordless way. She prayed that the smooth white skin she had spread across her walls would do the thing her husband had sworn it could do: hold the warmth, turn the sky's hunger back upon itself, keep 3 small lives from bleeding quietly away into the dark. The night stretched long. Eleni did not sleep. She sat in the faint orange glow of the banked stove, with the children breathing soft beside her, and she watched. She watched the one small window in the thin rented shack all those winters ago. The window had grown a thick blind skin of frost on a night not half this cold. Frost so heavy a body could not see the dark through it. Frost that crept inward and outward across the glass as the warmth drained out of the room, hour by hour, like water leaking from a cracked jar. She kept waiting for it to happen here. She kept bracing for the moment the cold would begin to win. But the hours passed, and the window stayed clear. A faint bloom of frost gathered along the very bottom edge of the glass, where the cold pressed hardest against the sill. But it did not climb. It did not spread its blind white fingers up across the pane. The hard, starlit dark stayed visible through the glass all night long, sharp and bright and held at bay, held back by something it could not see and did not understand. After a long while, Eleni rose, slow, her old knees aching against the floor, and she crossed the small room to the far wall, the wall furthest from the stove, the coldest wall in any house ever built, the wall that should, by every hard law she had ever lived under, be pouring a deep and killing chill into the room. She reached out her hand in the dark, and she pressed her bare palm flat against the smooth white skin. It was cool, only cool, not the biting, bone-deep cold of winter stone, not the wall that drinks the heat straight out of your hand the very instant you touch it. Just cool, neutral, quiet. A surface that took nothing from her and gave nothing back. A wall that simply held its place and did its silent work and asked for nothing at all. Eleni stood there a long time with her hand against that wall, and something broke open inside her chest. Not grief, this time. Something she had very nearly forgotten the shape of. Hope. It works, she whispered into the dark, to no one, to everyone, to the man who was not there to hear her. Stavros. It works. You were right. You were right all along. And out beyond that quiet, holding wall, beyond the smooth white shell that turned the hungry sky away, the rest of the camp had begun its long war with the night. They fought it the only way they had ever known how to fight, with fire. In cabin after cabin down the dark slope, families woke to a cold that had no name they knew, and they did the only thing in the world that made sense to them. They fed their stoves. They heaped on fuel. They built their fires high and hot and frantic. The iron of their stoves glowed a dull, angry red, scorching the air for 6 feet in every direction. And still, just past that small ring of furious heat, the far walls of their houses stayed cold enough to grow a pale ghost of frost along the head of every nail. They did not understand. That was the very heart of their suffering. They did not understand that the heat they fought so hard to make was pouring straight back out again, through their thick, dark walls, up into the open black sky above them. faster than any fire on earth could hope to replace it. They thought they were losing because they were not burning enough. So they burned more. They burned through wood they had counted on to carry them clear to spring. They burned it in a single night, in two. They watched their careful, hard-won woodpiles shrink with a slow horror they could not bring themselves to say out loud. And in the gray morning, they woke hollow-eyed and gray-faced, with a skin of ice in the water bucket and a chill in their bones that no fire seemed able to reach. And they told one another with cracked and hopeful lips that surely it would break soon. It did not break. The clear, killing nights came one after another, each one quieter and harder than the last. And night after night, the great black sky gave nothing back. There was a man in that camp named Cormac Vance who carried the letters. He was a lean, weathered fellow who had walked the frozen routes between those cabins for more years than most could remember. He knew the rhythms of the place better than any living soul. He knew which families were feuding and which were quietly courting. He knew who waited each week on word from far away and who dreaded the sight of him at the door. He knew that camp the way an old shepherd knows his flock. Not by their faces alone, but by their habits, their footprints, their smoke, their thousand small daily signs of life. And on these killing cold mornings, before the sun had even cleared the ridge, Cormac would set out on his rounds, and he would read the whole camp by its chimneys. It was an old habit, a survival habit. On a morning such as these, smoke meant life. A thick, hard-pumping plume meant a family was awake and fighting, feeding the stove with everything they had left. A thin, lazy wisp meant they were running low, or else, in some rare and well-built house, that they had no real need to burn at all. And no smoke. No smoke was the thing a man like Cormac had learned to dread above all others. No smoke meant a cold stove. A cold stove meant a cold house. And a cold house, on a night like the ones that camp was living through, could mean something far worse than mere discomfort. So each frozen dawn, Cormac walked his long route, and he counted the chimneys. And each frozen dawn, every last chimney in the camp was pumping smoke like a thing possessed. The Brennan cabin, the Hart cabin, the cluster of small houses down the slope, the big fine house up the rise where Garrett Holloway lived, all of them roaring, all of them pouring gray smoke up into the hard, bright air, all of them locked in the very same exhausting, losing war. Cormac counted them. He was grimly satisfied. And he walked on. He had not yet thought to wonder about the white house on the hill. Up in his fine, broad house at the top of the rise, Garrett Holloway was beginning, for the very first time, to feel a thing he was not at all accustomed to feeling. Unease. He had built well by the camp's measure, thick walls, a great iron stove, a deep, proud store of the finest coal, more than any other family had, because a man who holds the ledger never once lets his own box run empty. He had always been warm. He had always been certain. And to a man like Holloway, warmth and certainty had come to feel like very nearly the same comfortable thing. But on the third of those killing nights, he woke in the deep dark to find his own breath smoking in his own fine bedroom. He rose. He crossed to his desk, and he found that the ink in the well had frozen solid. A hard black plug of it. Not 15 steps from a stove he had kept burning all the night through. He stood there in the cold, looking down at that frozen ink. and the certainty he had worn so easily for so many years cracked, just slightly, like the first thin line spreading silent across a window pane. He fed the stove higher. He burned through his fine, deep store of coal faster than he would ever afterward admit to a living soul. And as he sat hunched and shivering by the roaring iron in the small hours, watching even his great fire fail to push the chill back out of the corners of his fine house, an unwelcome thought came creeping up on him out of the dark. If it's this bad up here, for me. He did not finish it. He would not let himself finish it, because to finish that thought was to be made to think of the others, the ones with thinner walls and emptier boxes, the ones he had never once had to think about, because thinking about them had never been his job. His job was the ledger. His job was the company's coin. The cold was just weather, and weather was nobody's fault, and a man could surely not be expected to carry the whole of a camp upon his own two shoulders. That was what he told himself, but there was one face the thought kept circling back toward, no matter how hard he tried to push it down. A small face, a little girl with her mother's eyes and a gap where her front tooth had lately been. His granddaughter, Posy. She was the one soft place in a hard man's life. The single person in all that camp who looked at Garrett Holloway and saw not the ledger, not the power, not the cold, gray certainty, but only Grandpa. Grandpa, who let her ride high on his shoulders down the road. Grandpa, who always saved her the candied bits from the store and pretended not to know how they had gotten into his pocket. She lived down the slope, with her mother in a modest cabin among the poorer houses, because Holloway's daughter had married a man with far more heart than wages, and she carried a stubborn pride of her own that would not let her move up the hill into her father's fine, warm house and live on his charity. It had never once troubled Holloway before. The cabin was small, but it was sound enough. The child was fine. He sent down coal when he happened to remember it, and he told himself that was plenty, and he did not look too closely at the daily lives of people he could comfortably afford not to look at. But on that third frozen night, with his own great fire failing and his own breath smoking white in his own fine room, a cold worry began at last to gnaw at the careful edges of Garrett Holloway's certainty. He told himself he would send coal down to her in the morning. He told himself the child was surely fine. He told himself a great many comfortable things in the dark that night, the way a proud man always does, right up until the very moment the world stops letting him. Down the slope, in the close-set cluster of the smaller cabins, the Brennan family was quietly losing its war. They were good people, the Brennans, a young couple with 3 small children, and a 4th one coming, and not nearly enough laid by to stand between them and a winter like this. And they had done everything right. Everything. They had stuffed every crack with rag and paper. They had dragged all the beds into the single room with the stove, and they slept piled together under every blanket and coat they owned. They had burned slow and careful and sparing, trying with all their hearts to make a thin store of fuel stretch across a cold that simply would not end. It had not been enough. By the deepest hour of the deepest night, their woodpile was gone, and the little store of coal behind it was nearly gone as well. And Maeve Brennan sat in the cold and the dark with her littlest asleep on her lap, and watched the last of the fire shrink down to a low and sullen glow. She did not wake her husband. He had gone out at dusk to beg or borrow fuel from any house that might have a little to spare, and he had not yet come home, and she would not let herself think too long about what that might mean. She only held her children close, and she watched the fire die. And she did the oldest thing in the world, the thing mothers have done in the cold dark since the beginning of everything. She made her own body into the last warm thing left in that room, and she gathered her babies in against it, and she prayed for the morning to come quickly. There was one more child in that cold cabin, not her own. Little Posy Holloway had come down to play with the Brennan children that very afternoon, the way she so often did. And the cold had come on so hard and so fast as the dusk fell that her mother, frightened of the freezing dark and the long way home, had sent word that the child should stay the night right where she was, rather than be carried back through the killing air. It had seemed, at the time, the safe choice. The Brennan cabin was closer. The Brennan family was kind. Surely, the mother had thought, a small child was safer staying put among friends than crossing all that frozen dark. She did not know the Brennan's fire was dying. She did not know that her own father's granddaughter, Garrett Holloway's one soft place in all the cold wide world, was, at that very hour, huddled in a cabin that was quietly running out of the one thing that could keep her alive until dawn. No one knew. That was how the cold worked in that camp on those nights. It did not announce its chosen ones. It crept in soft and quiet, through thin walls and dying fires, while everyone above and around it told themselves comfortable things and looked away from the dark. And up on the hill, in the single house, in all that camp, that the cold could not enter. Eleni sat awake beside her small banked fire. She did not know about the Brennan's dying stove. She did not know that a proud man's granddaughter slept in a freezing cabin down the slope. She knew none of it. She knew only that her own 2 children were warm. She knew that the impossible thing she had been mocked and starved and cast out for had turned out, in the end, to be true. That the smooth white wall really did hold the heat. That she had wagered everything on her dead husband's stubborn old wisdom, and on her own stubborn faith, and that she had been right. She should have felt triumphant. She did not. She sat in the warm dark and she looked at the faces of her sleeping grandchildren, and she thought about the camp below, the people who had turned away from her, the women who had closed against her like doors swinging shut, and she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she could not feel glad about being warm while all of them were cold. She thought of Della Hart, and her face like a slammed door. You'd let that boy go cold. For mud. She thought of the children who had laughed and called her house the ice house. She thought of all of them, every one, down there in the killing dark, burning everything they owned and still losing, because no living soul had ever taught them what she had been only lucky enough to learn: that you cannot win against the hungry sky by fighting it. You can only refuse it. You can only build the mirror and turn its hunger away. And she thought, with a slow and deepening ache, they don't know. They're freezing to death down there, and they don't even know why. It was not a comfortable thought to sit alone with. A harder woman might have let them freeze. A bitter woman. A woman who had been mocked and starved and cast out into the cold by her own neighbors might have sat warm in her white house and let the long night teach the camp the very lesson she had tried and failed to teach them with her own 2 hands. Eleni was not that woman. She had buried a husband. She had taken in 2 orphaned children when her own strength was already worn down to the thread. And she had learned the long and bitter way that the world hands a person very little in the end, and that the only thing that makes the cold truly bearable, when all is said and done, is the warmth you are still willing to carry to someone else. She did not yet know what the night was about to ask of her. She did not know that down the slope a fire was dying, that children she had never once laid eyes on were beginning to slip, slow and sleepy, toward the deep cold that does not let a body go. That Garrett Holloway's own granddaughter lay among them, and that the very man who had cut off her fuel and tried so hard to drive her from her home was, even at that moment, telling himself comfortable lies in his own failing house, with no idea at all that the cold had come, quiet and patient, for the one small thing he truly loved. She did not know any of it, but she was awake, and out in the killing dark, the great sky drank on, patient, endless, reaching down through every thin wall and every dying fire in that camp, reaching for everyone who had no mirror to turn it back. The deepest hour of the night arrived, the hour when the cold bites hardest and the dark lies thickest, and the body wants nothing in all the world but to close its heavy eyes and rest, just for a moment, just to rest. In the Brennan cabin, the very last coal winked out, and Maeve Brennan, holding her sleeping children in the pitch dark, felt the warmth begin to leave that room for good, and she knew, with a mother's terrible and absolute clarity, that the morning was still far too many hours away. So she made a decision. The kind of decision a person only ever makes when every other door in the world has already swung shut against them. She could not carry all of them, not through the frozen dark, not in her condition, not far. But there was one house she had heard the others whisper of, one impossible house, the very one the whole camp had spent the autumn laughing at, the ice house, the white house up on the hill, where the strange old widow lived all alone with her 2 grandchildren. Maeve did not know if the stories were true. She did not know whether there was real warmth up there, or only a mad old woman and a wall of foolish white mud. She knew one thing, and one thing only. Her own fire was dead, and the hill was the nearest place in all that frozen dark that might, just might, still hold a little heat. And so, in the deepest and coldest hour of that long and killing night, a desperate decision was made, in the dark, by a frightened young mother. A decision that would carry the whole camp and the proud man who ruled it, and the cast-out widow who had been right about everything all along, straight toward the dawn that was about to change every last one of them forever. The knock came in the deepest part of the night. Eleni almost did not hear it. It was such a small sound, so faint against the great frozen silence, that for a long moment she thought she had only imagined it. A branch settling under the weight of the cold. The old house breathing. Nothing at all. Then it came again. Weak. Frantic. The sound of a hand that had almost no strength left in it. She was at the door before she had even decided to move. Her old body knew, the way an old body sometimes knows things before the mind catches up, that a knock in the dead of such a night was never a small thing. When she pulled the door open, the cold poured in like water over a riverbank, and there on her step stood a sight that stopped the breath cold in her throat. A young woman, swaying on her feet, her arms full of children. It was Maeve Brennan. She stood in the killing dark with her babies bundled against her, and her lips had gone gray, and her eyes were wide and glassy with cold and terror. She had carried them up the long hill through the frozen black, one trip and then another still, until every last one of them was huddled there on the widow's step, too spent to do anything but lean into the dark and wait. 3 small Brennan children, and one more besides. A little girl, smaller than the rest, her face gone white as the wall behind her, her teeth no longer even chattering. That stillness in the small girl frightened Eleni more than any crying ever could have, because she had nursed the cold out of small bodies before. And she knew the terrible truth of it. A child who has stopped shivering is a child the cold has very nearly finished with. "Please," Maeve whispered. It was all she had left in her. One word, cracked and frozen. "Please. I didn't know where else to." Eleni did not let her finish. "Inside," she said. "All of you. Now. Quickly." And she reached out into the dark with both her arms and gathered them in. She did not ask who they were. She did not ask why they had come, of all the doors in that whole camp, to the door of the very woman every one of them had cast aside. She did not pause, not for a single heartbeat, to think of the cold company store, or the closed credit, or the women who had turned their faces from her at the wash line. She thought only of the children. She drew them in out of the dark, every one, and she shut the heavy door against the hungry sky. And then she went to work, the way only a woman who has fought the cold for the lives of small ones knows how to work. Blankets. Every blanket the small house owned. Warm cloths wrung out fast over the kettle. Her own 2 old hands chafing the frozen life back into small fingers and small feet. One child and then the next, never stopping, murmuring low and steady the whole while, the way a person gentles a frightened animal in the dark. There now. You're safe. You're warm now. There now, little one. And then, the strangest and most beautiful thing began to happen in that small white house. The children began to thaw, not slowly, not the way a body thaws in a cabin fighting a losing war against the dark, gaining 1 thin inch of warmth and surrendering too. They thawed the way a thing thaws when it has at last come in out of the wind for good and all. Deep, steady, whole, the gray began to leave their lips. The shivering came back to them, hard and violent and shaking, which Eleni knew in her wise old bones to welcome with her whole heart. Because shivering is the body remembering that it is still alive. Shivering is the fight coming back. And then, slowly, even the shivering eased, and a real warmth, a deep, even, forgiving warmth, settled down over all of them, like a hand laid gently on a fevered brow. Maeve Brennan sat in the middle of it with a blanket around her shoulders and a cup of something hot pressed between her 2 raw hands, and she looked around that small, glowing, impossible house, and she began, very quietly, to weep, not from grief, from something she had no name for, because it was warm. That was all. That was everything. It was simply, plainly, gently warm. Not the desperate, scorching, roaring heat of an overfed stove, blazing in one corner while the far wall grew its ghost of frost. This was a warmth without effort, a warmth that filled the whole room from floor to ceiling, from one wall clear to the other. A warmth that asked for no great fire, no shrinking woodpile, no terror in the dark. Maeve looked at the little stove with its small banked coals. She looked at that low, quiet, dying down fire. A fire that, in her own poor cabin, would not have warmed a single child through a single hour. And she could not, for the life of her, understand how it was keeping a whole roomful of souls alive. "How?" she breathed at last. "How is it so warm in here? Your fire's near gone out." Eleni did not stop her work. She was easing a warmed cloth around the smallest girl's bare blue feet. "It is not the fire," she said softly. "The fire is small. It was always going to be small. I had no coal left for a great one." She lifted her eyes then to the smooth white walls, glowing faint and pale in the low stove light. "It is the walls," she said. "The walls hold what little warmth we make. They will not let the sky reach in and take it." A small, tired, knowing smile touched the corner of her mouth. "Everyone in your camp laughed. They called it the ice house. They said I'd gone foolish with grief." She looked back down at the child. "But the cold cannot get in through these walls, and the warmth cannot get out. That is all it ever was. That is the whole of the secret your whole camp spent the autumn laughing at." Maeve stared at those pale walls, as though seeing a thing she had no words for. And something in her young face, something that had been clenched shut with fear and shame and exhaustion, began very slowly to come unclenched. Her eyes drifted then to a small table set against the far wall, the coldest corner of the house, the place furthest from the stove. And there, on that table, sat a humble clay crock with a cloth tied over its mouth, and beside it, a plain pitcher of water. In her own cabin that night, the water bucket had grown a thick plug of ice not 3 steps from the fire. In every cabin down that slope, water left out had frozen solid as stone. But on that far cold table, in that far cold corner, the widow's pitcher of water stood clear and perfectly liquid. And when Eleni saw where the young mother was looking, she said gently, "The bread will rise tonight, even there, even in the coldest corner of the house." She nodded toward the little crock. "My mother kept her starter alive through 40 winters. I keep mine the same, and it has never once frozen under this roof. Not on the hardest night, not once." Maeve looked at the liquid water and the living bread in the coldest corner of a warm house on the coldest night of her life, and the last of something hard inside her broke and fell away. It was then that Eleni looked closely, for the first time, at the smallest child, the little white-faced girl she had pulled in last and warmed first of all, the one who had frightened her so on the step with her terrible stillness. She was coming back now. Color was creeping into her round cheeks. Her small chest rose and fell, deep and slow and even, in a true and healing sleep at last, safe in the very middle of the heap of blankets by the stove. Eleni brushed the damp hair back from the child's forehead with one rough, gentle finger. And she went very still, because she knew that small face. She had seen it before, riding high and laughing on a hard man's broad shoulders down the muddy road. She had seen it peering shyly out from behind his legs in the company store, on the very day he closed the credit against her and told her flat to sell her land and take her grandchildren and go. This was his granddaughter. This was Garrett Holloway's grandchild, the child of the very man who had tried to take everything she had in all the world. The man who had cut off her fire in the dead heart of winter and called it nothing personal. The man who had built a trap out of the cold itself and set it patient and quiet at her door, and waited for it to drive her out. His own blood, asleep in her blankets, warmed back from the very edge of the dark by her hands. Eleni knelt there in the firelight a long moment, very quiet, and looked down at the sleeping child. And whatever bitterness might have risen up in another woman's heart in that moment, whatever cold and bitter sweetness, whatever small and human voice might have whispered, "Let him learn what cold feels like. Let him feel for once what I felt," did not rise in hers. She only reached out and pulled the blanket a little higher around the small, thin shoulders. And she let the child sleep. Because a child is a child. The cold does not care whose grandchild you are or whose ledger your grandfather keeps. The cold reaches for them all the same. And neither, in the end, did Eleni care. She had not built her mirror to hoard the warmth for herself and her own. She had built it to refuse the dark, and the dark, she had long ago decided, did not get to choose which children she would let it take. Not while she had breath in her, and a wall at her back, and a fire, however small, still glowing in the iron. So through the rest of that long and killing night, the White House on the hill held them all, the 3 Brennan children, their young, frightened mother, the proud man's small granddaughter, and Eleni's own Nico and Thalia, who woke in the dark and made room without one word of complaint, shifting their blankets, sharing their warmth, the way children do when their grandmother has taught them, simply by the daily living of it, exactly what a house is for and what it is not. The house held them in an even, unhurried, patient warmth, while outside the great black sky drank and drank at the frozen world, and inside a small banked fire and a wall of foolish white mud kept every last living soul beneath that roof safe and warm and breathing until the morning. The morning came pale and hard and slow over the ridge. And down in the heart of the camp, Cormac Vance set out on his rounds, the way he did every frozen dawn, walking the long route between the cabins with the bitter cold, biting clean through every layer of wool he owned. And as he always did, he read the chimneys, smoke, smoke, smoke. Every house pumping it up thick into the bright, bitter air. Every family still locked deep in the same exhausting, losing war they had been fighting for nights on end. He passed the Brennan cabin, and he frowned hard at it, for its chimney stood oddly cold and silent and still. But he told himself the family had simply burned through the last of their fuel and gone in the night to crowd in with kinder neighbors. And he made a note in his mind to come back and be sure of it, and he walked on. And then he lifted his eyes to the hill, to the White House, and the breath stopped dead in his chest. There was no smoke, none, not a wisp, not a thread, not the faintest gray curl rising from the chimney of the strange old widow's house on the hill. The chimney stood cold and silent and lifeless against the pale dawn sky, as still as a stone set up over a grave. Cormac stood frozen in the middle of the road, staring up at it, and a terrible dread rolled over him, cold as the air itself. He knew what no smoke meant on a morning like this one. He had known it his whole long life on these frozen routes. No smoke meant a cold stove. A cold stove meant a cold house. And a cold house after a night like the one that had just passed over them all. He thought of the old woman up there on the hill, the one they had all laughed at, the one whose credit had been closed against her, the one whose fuel had run out. Everyone knew her fuel had run out. The whole camp had watched her spend her very last coins on a sack of white mud, while her own grandson lay burning with fever. He thought of the two small children up there with her, and his old heart turned over hard in his chest. "No," he said aloud, to no one at all in the empty frozen road. "Oh no, no, no." He did not finish his rounds. He turned and he ran, as fast as a lean old man can run on frozen ground, with the cold tearing like knives at the inside of his chest, back toward the heart of the camp, calling out hoarse as he went, his cracked voice carrying far in the still and frozen air. And the camp came awake to his cry. Doors banged open. Faces appeared, pale and blinking in the cold. And the words spread from cabin to cabin faster than any fire ever could, the way the very worst news always travels. The widow, the children, no smoke from the ice house, no smoke at all, not a thread. And one by one, the people of that camp pulled on their coats and stepped out into the killing cold. And they turned, and they looked up at the hill, at the silent white house standing cold and still against the rising dawn. And one by one, every last face among them fell. Because they understood. They understood all at once exactly what they had done. They had laughed at her. They had named her house a folly and her grief a madness. They had stood by and let a proud man cut off her fire in the dead of winter, and they had turned their own faces away from her at the wash line. And they had let her climb that long hill alone with two small children and a sack of white mud and an empty coal box, and not one of them, not a single solitary soul in all that camp, had carried so much as one lump of coal up to her door. And now there was no smoke. Della Hart stood in the frozen road with her hand pressed hard over her mouth. You'd let that boy go cold. For mud. She had said that. To the woman's own face. On the road. She had said those very words. And the shame of it rose up in her now, and in all of them, cold and sick and far, far too late, as they stood huddled in the frozen road and stared up at the silent house and waited to learn what their own hardness of heart had finally cost. And then the sun cleared the ridge. It came up pure and cold and pink behind the white house on the hill. The first true light of the day spilled down over the snow-covered slope, racing down the white field toward the silent house. And it struck the smooth white walls of the widow's home, and the house began to glow. It did not merely catch the light, it gathered it. The smooth, burnished, snow-white skin that Eleni had polished by hand, with a river stone, hour upon hour, day upon day, all through the long autumn that the whole camp had spent laughing at her bent and aching back. That skin caught the pure pink dawn light, and it turned it soft and warm and luminous, until the whole house glowed a gentle, living rose against the gray and frozen world. It did not look like a tomb. It glowed like a banked ember, like a pearl held up to a candle, like something warm and alive and deeply at peace, nestled there on the cold hillside while all the dark and frozen world held its breath around it. The whole camp stood silent in the road and stared up at it. And as they stared, the heavy door of the glowing house swung open, and Eleni stepped out into the rose-colored dawn. Alive, upright, steady, a blanket around her shoulders and the warm light soft on her tired, weathered face. She stood in her own doorway and looked down at the camp gathered in the road below, and she did not say a word. And behind her, crowding into the open doorway, small faces, children, Nico, Thalia, and other children too. More than two. More small faces than had ever lived beneath that roof, peering out wide-eyed at the bright, cold morning. The camp did not understand at first what it was seeing. For a long moment they only stared, their breath pluming in the frozen air, their minds refusing to catch up to their eyes. They had come up out of their cabins braced to mourn. They had come ready to find a tomb and to carry their shame in their hands for the rest of their days. And instead, they found a house full of living children, glowing rose in the dawn. Then a young man came shoving and stumbling through the crowd in the road. Brennan returned at last from his long and desperate night of begging fuel from door to door, half frozen, wild-eyed, having come home in the gray dark to a cold and empty cabin and found his whole family simply gone. The beds empty, the fire dead, no trace of them in all the frozen world. He looked up at the hill, and he saw his 3 children standing alive in the widow's glowing doorway. The sound that came out of him then was not a word. It was older than any word. It was the raw and broken sound a man makes when the very worst thing he has ever let himself imagine is suddenly, impossibly, mercifully taken away from him. He ran for the hill. He ran as though his own heart were dragging him up the slope, and the camp, breaking all at once from its frozen shame, began to surge up the hill behind him. But there was one more soul who came to the hill that morning. Word of the dying fires and the empty cabins had at last reached the top of the rise, and a frantic young mother had run through the gray dawn to her father's fine, warm house, and pounded both fists upon his door, and cried out into the dark that her little girl had stayed the night down the slope, down among the small, poor cabins, down in the very place where all the fires had failed. And so Garrett Holloway came down off his rise, coatless, hatless, the proud man who held the ledger, the man who closed the credit and called it nothing personal, and slept warm and certain in his great fine house while the camp below him froze, running now, stumbling through the frozen dawn, with his daughter weeping at his side and a raw terror in his chest he had never once known in all his comfortable years. Searching wildly for one small face among the cold and empty cabins, he found the Brennan cabin standing cold and dark and empty, and his heart very nearly stopped dead within him. He stood in that empty doorway, with the cold pouring around him. And for one endless and terrible moment, Garrett Holloway knew exactly what it was to have the world take the one thing he truly loved, and to be helpless, utterly helpless, to stop it. And then someone in the gathering crowd caught hold of his arm, and turned him, and pointed, without a word, up the hill, up at the glowing white house, where the children stood alive and warm in the doorway, in the soft rose light of the dawn, and where his own small granddaughter, warmed back from the very edge of the dark through the long killing night, now stood wrapped in a blanket, safe and whole, and blinking at the morning, held gently in the arms of the very woman he had tried so hard to drive out into the cold. Garrett Holloway stood at the bottom of the hill, and he looked up at the house he had called a fool's folly, at the wall he had sworn would run like spilled milk by spring, at the widow he had tried with all his quiet power to ruin, standing now in her glowing doorway with his own blood safe and warm against her heart, looking back down the hill at him, quiet, steady, asking him for nothing, accusing him of nothing, just looking at him, and something deep in the proud man's chest, something that had been frozen hard and solid for a very long time, something he had perhaps believed was simply the way a strong man was built, began at last, in the rose light of that cold and breaking dawn, to crack. Garrett Holloway climbed the hill. He climbed it slow, not the way a powerful man walks, with the easy certainty of a body that has never once doubted its right to any ground it stands on. He climbed it like a man walking toward something he was afraid to see. One heavy step, and then another, up through the frozen snow, toward the glowing white house and the small face waiting safe in the widow's arms. The crowd in the road below had gone quiet. They watched him go. They all knew what had passed between this man and this woman. They had watched him close the credit. They had heard him swear the white wall would run like spilled milk. They had, every one of them, taken his certainty as their own, and laughed when he laughed, and turned away when he turned away. Now they watched the proud man climb the hill toward the woman he had wronged, and not one of them said a word. When he reached the top, he stopped. His daughter pushed past him with a broken cry and ran the last few steps, and fell to her knees in the doorway, gathering up her little girl, pressing her wet face into the child's hair, rocking her, holding her, the way a mother holds a thing she had already begun to grieve. And Elaney let the child go to her, gently, without a word. She simply opened her arms and gave the little girl back to her mother, and stepped aside and let the two of them weep together in the warm rose light of her doorway. Then she turned, and she faced Garrett Holloway. He stood there in the cold, with no coat and no hat, and no certainty left anywhere on him. He opened his mouth to speak, and nothing came. What was there to say? What words does a man reach for when he has spent a whole season trying to drive a woman out into the cold, and that same woman has spent the worst night of the winter saving the one small life he could not bear to lose? There were no words for that, so Elaney did not wait for him to find any. "Come inside," she said simply. "You're cold. Come inside and be warm, and see your granddaughter breathe." And she turned, and she walked back into her house, and after a long moment, the proud man followed her in. Inside, the warmth wrapped around him like something living. Holloway stopped just past the door, and he felt it. That deep, even, effortless warmth, filling the whole room from the floor to the low ceiling. He had come up out of his own great fine house, where a roaring fire and a deep store of the finest coal had still left his breath smoking in the dark. And here, in this small house, the whole camp had mocked, with a fire so low it was barely more than embers. It was warm, truly warm, warmer than his own great house had been all night. His eyes moved around the small room, the children, thawed and safe, dozing in their heap of blankets, the young Brennan mother holding her cup, watching him with eyes that did not yet know whether to trust the sight of him. The little stove with its small, banked, dying down fire. And the walls, the smooth white walls, glowing soft in the morning light. Slowly, almost without meaning to, Garrett Holloway crossed the room to the far wall, the coldest wall in any house, the wall that should, by every law he had ever lived by, be pouring a deep and killing chill into the room on a morning like this one. He reached out one bare hand. He flinched before he even touched it, bracing for the bite. It never came. The wall was not cold. After a night that had frozen the ink solid in his own fine house, this far wall, above a stove banked down to almost nothing, met his hand the way a sun-warmed stone meets it in spring. Patient, steady, giving up nothing to the dark, and his hand began to shake, because a whole lifetime of certainty was telling him one thing, and the bare skin of his own palm was telling him another, and the two could not both be true. It broke something loose in him, his certainty, the thing he had worn like armor for so many years that he had forgotten it was something he was wearing, and not simply the shape of who he was. He turned, slow, and looked at the widow. "You didn't build a wall," he said. His voice came out cracked and low, barely more than a whisper. "You built a mirror." Eleni did not answer right away. She looked at him standing there, the proud man, undone, his hands still resting against the wall he had sworn would crumble, his eyes wet and lost, and finally open. "No," she said gently, "not a mirror for the eye, a mirror for the cold." She nodded toward the low fire. "You were never fighting the cold, Garrett Holloway," she said quietly. "You were feeding the sky. All of you were." She touched the white wall herself, fondly, the way a person touches a thing they have made with their own two hands. "This does not fight," she said. "It refuses. It sends the warmth back inside where it belongs. It keeps." A small smile. "That is all it ever did. It keeps what little we have, instead of letting the dark carry it off." Holloway stared at her, and then his face crumpled, because all at once he understood the whole shape of what he had done. He had cut off her fuel. He had closed her credit in the dead of winter and called it nothing personal. He had built her a trap out of the cold itself, meaning to drive her out, meaning to make her sell and go. And the only reason she had survived it, the only reason there had been any warmth in this house at all on the killing night just past, was the very wall he had mocked, the very folly he had sworn would fail. If she had been a lesser builder, if she had given up that night on the store steps and bought coal instead of clay, if she had been even 1 ounce less stubborn than she was, then this house would have been cold. And the children would have come up the hill in the dark and found no warmth waiting. And his granddaughter, his Posy, would not be sleeping safe in a heap of blankets right now. She would be. He could not finish the thought. His knees nearly gave under the weight of it. I tried to take this from you, he said. The words came out of him broken, one at a time, like stones being pulled up out of frozen ground. I closed your credit. I told you to sell. I would have let you freeze, and called it the company's business, and slept easy. He looked at the sleeping child in his daughter's arms. And you saved her. After everything I did, you opened your door, and you took her in, and you warmed her back to life with your own hands. My blood, mine. His voice broke clean apart. Why? He whispered. Why would you do that? For me? Eleni looked at him for a long, quiet moment, and when she answered, there was no triumph in it, no bitterness, no cold and well-earned satisfaction, only something tired and clear and very old. I did not do it for you, she said. I did it for her. She looked at the sleeping child. A child came to my door in the cold. That is all I needed to know. I did not ask whose child. I did not ask what her grandfather had done to me. The cold does not ask those questions when it reaches for a child. So neither did I. She drew a slow breath. You closed a door against me, Garrett Holloway, and I could have closed one against you. Easy. I had every right. Her voice softened. But a closed door is how all of this began. A closed door is what nearly killed every soul in this house last night. I have spent a whole winter watching what closed doors cost. She shook her head, slow. I would not add another, not even against you, especially not against you. And the proud man stood in the small, warm house. And he wept, not the polished, careful tears of a man performing his sorrow for an audience, the real kind, the kind that come up from somewhere a person has kept locked and frozen for years, and break through all at once, and cannot be stopped. He wept for the wrong he had done. He wept for the child he had nearly lost. He wept for the long, cold years he had spent mistaking hardness for strength, and certainty for wisdom, and a full coal box for a life well lived. And Eleni, who had every reason in the world to let him weep alone, crossed the small room and put a hand on his shoulder and led him. Word of what had happened on the hill ran through the camp by midday. It did not run the way mockery runs, fast and cruel and hungry for the next thing to laugh at. It moved slower than that, heavier, the way a deep truth moves through people, settling into them, changing the shape of things as it goes. The widow had saved them, the widow they had laughed at, the widow whose house they had named the Ice House, whose grief they had called madness, whose wall they had sworn would run like spilled milk by spring. She had taken the cold into her hands and turned it away. And then she had opened her door in the dead of the killing night and saved the children of the very people who had cast her out. By the time the sun stood high over the frozen camp, they had begun to come up the hill, not all at once, in ones and twos and small ashamed clusters, carrying things, a side of bacon, a sack of meal, an armload of wood, a jar of preserves saved back for some special day that suddenly seemed less important than this one, They came up the hill the way people come when they do not have the words to say what they need to say, and so they bring something instead, and let the bringing speak for them. Della Hart came. She climbed the hill last of all, and slowest, because her shame was the heaviest to carry. She stood in the doorway of the White House with a loaf of her own bread held out in both hands, and she could not, at first, make herself look the widow in the eye. "I said a terrible thing to you," Della managed at last. Her voice was very small. "On the road, about the boy, about the mud. I said you'd let him go cold." She finally lifted her eyes. "And then you went and saved half this camp's children with that same mud I mocked, including," her voice failed her, "including some of mine." The Hart children had been among the small ones who came up the hill in the night. Della had not known where they were until the dawn. She had spent those black hours believing the worst, the same as all the rest. "I have no right to your forgiveness," Della whispered. "I know that. I wanted you to know that I know it." Eleni looked at her a long moment, and then she did something that undid the younger woman completely. She reached out and took the offered loaf, and she smiled, a real smile, warm and tired, and without one trace of anger in it. "Come in out of the cold, Della," she said. "The bread will keep. You won't. Come in and sit by the fire, and let us forget the road." And Della Hart, who had closed her face like a door against this woman on a cold morning not so long ago, came in and sat by the fire and was forgiven. That was the thing about Eleni. The camp slowly came to understand in the days that followed. She did not keep accounts. She had every right to. She could have spent the rest of her years nursing the memory of every slight, every smirk, every closed door and turned away face. She could have been hard. The world had certainly given her cause enough to be. But she had buried a husband and taken in 2 orphan children and learned the long hard way that a heart kept hard against the world is just one more house feeding its warmth to the empty sky. So she did not keep accounts. She kept warmth. And she gave it away. As the days passed and the great cold finally broke its grip on the camp, the people began to ask her the question that none of them had ever bothered to ask before. How? How had she done it? How did the wall work? How did a woman alone, with white dust on her hands and a sack of clay on her shoulder, hold back a cold that had nearly killed them all? And so, in the warm afternoons, with her door open and her fire low and her neighbors gathered close, Eleni told them. She told them about the lime and the clean sand and the fine white clay from the wash up the canyon. She told them how to slake the lime slow and never rush it, no matter the cold or the failing light, because a wall built in a hurry is a wall built for ruin. She told them how to lay the render thick, not thin, a coat for living, not a coat for show. And she told them about the river stone and the long patient hours of burnishing until the rough white skin grew dense and bright and smooth as still water. "It is not my secret," she told them more than once. "I want you to understand that. I did not invent it." And then she told them about Stavros. She told them how he had come from a far place across the sea, where the sun was the enemy and families had learned to turn it away. How he had carried that old knowledge across an ocean in his 2 hands. How he had understood stone the way other men understood weather, where it would split, where it would hold, how it breathed in the day and gave its warmth back at night. He meant to build this himself, she said softly. The White House, the shield. He ran out of time. She looked at the smooth, glowing walls around her. Everyone thought the knowing died with him. They thought it went into the ground when he did. A man's craft, a man's secret, gone. A small, fierce light came into her tired eyes. But I watched him. All those years, I watched his hands, and I listened, and I remembered. I carried more than anyone ever thought to give me credit for. She lifted her own rough, white-stained hands and looked at them. The knowing did not die with him. It was here, in these, the whole time. It only needed a winter hard enough to ask for it. And the camp, gathered close around her in the warmth, understood at last what they had so very nearly thrown away. Not a foolish old widow. A keeper of something precious, something they had all been too proud and too hasty to see, right up until the night it saved their lives. The next season, the hillside changed. When the cold weather came creeping back, it did not find the camp as it had found it before. One by one, all through the warm months, the white houses had risen. Cabin after cabin, dark stone disappearing under a thick burnished coat of bright white clay, until the whole hillside, that had once been a row of dark and struggling huts, glowed pale and clean against the slope like a string of pearls. People came from the camps beyond, in time, to see them. They would stand in the road and stare at the strange white houses, and shake their heads, and say it could not be true, that a coat of mud could turn back the cold, that you could keep a house warm with a small fire by simply refusing to let the warmth escape. And then they would touch the cool walls with their own hands, and feel the even warmth inside, and go home and build their own. The knowing spread the way warmth spreads in a good house, slow and even and quiet, reaching every cold corner in its own time. And no one, anywhere it spread, ever quite forgot where it had come from. The widow on the hill, the woman they had laughed at, the keeper of the old secret that the proud had nearly let the cold carry away. As for Garrett Holloway, he was not, in the end, a man beyond saving. That was perhaps the most surprising thing of all. He could have nursed his shame into bitterness, the way hard men so often do. He could have hated the woman who had shown him what he was. He did not. He took the lesson, and he carried it, and he let it change him. The credit at the store opened again, for everyone on fair terms, and never closed in the dead of winter against a soul in need. Not once, for as long as Garrett Holloway held the ledger. He saw to it that no family in that camp ran out of fuel on a killing night. He saw to it that the white clay from the wash was free for the hauling to any household that wanted it. And whenever a newcomer laughed at the strange pale houses on the hill, it was Holloway himself, more often than not, who set them straight. "Don't you laugh at that wall," he would say, low and serious. "I laughed at that wall once. It nearly cost me everything I love." He never told her he was sorry again after that first broken morning. He did not have to. He simply spent the rest of his years proving it, which is the only apology, in the end, that ever truly counts for anything. And Eleni, the widow who had stood alone on the frozen hillside at the start of it all, burying her grief into a wall of white, with the whole camp laughing at her back. She was not alone anymore. That was the quiet thing the winter had given her, the thing she had never once thought to ask for, because grief makes a person stop believing such things are still possible. Her small white house, which had begun as a fortress for 2 orphaned children and a heartbroken woman, became something else as the seasons turned. A gathering place, a warm door always open. The young Brennan mother came often, with her new baby and her growing brood, and called Eleni something close to family. The children of the camp, who had once chanted Ice House at her from the safety of the road, now ran up the hill to sit at her low fire and beg her for the old stories from across the sea. Della Hart became a true friend at last, the kind a woman finds late, and treasures all the more for the lateness of it. And little Posy Holloway, the child who had come to her white-faced and still in the worst hour of the dark, grew up calling her grandmother, the same as the grandfather up the hill. 2 grandparents bound forever by a single cold night and a wall of white clay. The child never knew, until she was much older, the whole hard story of what had passed between the 2 of them. She only knew that they were kind to each other now, that they sat together sometimes in the warm evenings, the proud old man and the widow he had wronged, and did not speak much, and did not need to. Because some debts are not paid with words. Some debts are paid with warmth, given freely across all the long years that follow. On the coldest, clearest nights, Eleni still kept the old habit. She would rise in the dark while the children slept, and cross her small warm room, and press her palm flat against the far white wall, just to feel it, cool and quiet and holding, doing its silent work, turning the hungry sky away from everyone she loved. And on those nights, with her hand against the wall her husband had taught her to build, in the house full of sleeping breath that had once been so terribly empty, she did not feel alone. She felt him there, in the warmth that did not leave, in the wall that would not let the dark take what mattered, in the knowing that had not died with him after all, but had lived on in her stubborn, patient hands, and saved a camp full of children, and woven a lonely widow back into a world she had thought was finished with her. She would stand there a while in the warm dark, and then she would go back to her bed and pull up the blankets and sleep, warm, held, and not alone. There is an old truth folded into a story like this one. The world is quick to laugh at the strange ones, the quiet ones, the old ones, the old women most of all, with their odd ways and their bent backs and their stubborn faith in things the world has long since stopped believing in. It is an easy thing to call such a woman foolish, an easy thing to close a door, but every now and then, one of them is carrying something, a knowing, a warmth, an old, old secret the proud and the hasty have forgotten how to see. Right up until the night it becomes the only thing standing between a child and the cold. That was the widow on the hill, the woman they laughed at, the woman who built a mirror for the cold, and would not keep its warmth for herself, who opened her door in the dead of the longest night and gave it away.